Hi everyone, Payton from rankingsrightnow.com. For the second straight week, we had to wait till the very last second of the BYU game to figure out where all of the rankings were going to end up. You can't just have one game where nothing is going to happen to the rankings. Everything affects everything. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive on into the recap of Week 12, where we believe the rankings are going to be, and what this means moving forward. So let's go ahead and jump on into rankingsrightnow.com. Go ahead and create yourself a free login. You can go ahead and pick your favorite teams. You can participate in our weekly challenges. You can even have access to our what if simulation tool, which we will play with here in a minute. But most importantly, let's take a look at the projected Week 13 rankings for the playoff selection committee coming up on Tuesday. For those of you who are new to rankings right now, we have trained a machine learning algorithm based off of historical training data of the college football selection committee. What that means for you non-mathematicians are all of the voting that's happened in the past. We've trained algorithms to pick up those patterns and apply it to what we see happening today. Now, this happens in real time, so you don't need to wait until Tuesday to find out the results. You can see a little bit of a sneak peek on what historically the playoff committee has done in the past. Now, let's go ahead and start to digest what all of this means. If we look at the top 5 teams, 1 through 5, everything stays still. There's not a lot of movement. Oregon had a little bit of a scare with Wisconsin today, but Ohio State, Texas, Penn State, no problem. Indiana's on a bye this week. Then things start to get a little bit interesting. Georgia moves up from 12 to 6. Notre Dame moves up to 7. Alabama up to 8. Miami and Boise State then at 9 and 10. Boise State with a really nice win. They had a little bit of a back and forth with San Jose State, but end up coming out with a really nice win. Genty goes up for another monster night. So once that has been established, there's one piece of information that I really want to dive into, and that is Tennessee and BYU. Why do I care so much about where these two teams ended up? Because of last weekend. If we remember last weekend, our algorithm, and if we go over to the what if simulation tool, we can dive a little bit more into this. But if we go to the Week 12 projected rankings, we projected Georgia to fall all the way down to number 11 and Miami to fall all the way down to number 12. Now, if you remember, Georgia had lost on the road to a ranked Ole Miss team. Miami had lost on the road to an unranked Georgia Tech team. Georgia was ranked 3rd. Miami was ranked 4th. By that logic, you would have assumed that Miami would still have been behind Georgia. Georgia had a more high-quality loss, if you want to think of it from that way. And Georgia was already ahead of Miami, since Georgia was 3 and Miami was 4. That's not what ended up happening. Miami only dropped 5 spots to number 9, and Georgia fell 9 spots to number 12. I still don't understand what the logic behind that was. So, why is that important? Well, if we go back to today, we're kind of in another predicament here. Tennessee was number 7. BYU was number 6. Tennessee is projected to fall down 7 spots. BYU is projected to fall down 9 spots. The BYU loss is a worse loss than Tennessee's loss. Tennessee lost to Georgia. That's been a top 5 team the entire year, right? Except for last weekend, according to the rankings committee. BYU just lost to Kansas. That was sub 500 on the year. Where are these two going to be ranked going into a Tuesday? That is the biggest question that I have. Is this 14 and 15 area? Does Tennessee only drop a couple less spots because the selection committee really respects Georgia? Does BYU take a bigger fall, right? They've started already really higher in the rankings than a lot of people were suggesting, right? They're not undefeated anymore. They don't have that little asterisk next to them like Indiana does, right? Indiana's strength of schedule isn't as good as BYU's, but they haven't lost. BYU has an L in their category now. So that is where things are so interesting to me on where BYU is going to end up. Let's even do a what-if simulation with BYU real quick. If BYU would have scored a touchdown there at the very end, right? And let's say they finished that game 20-17, with the what-if simulation tool at rankingsrightnow.com, you can change it. You go ahead and you can look at the games that you've altered. You can run the simulation, and just like that, it will return back what the predicted rankings would be in this scenario. So in this scenario, BYU drops a spot to Georgia, but they're still the number 1 ranked Big 12 team. Now that we don't have that situation anymore, you have to go all the way down to 15, where they're right next to number 17, Colorado. Now, why did CU not move in the rankings? According to the algorithm, Clemson had a better win on the road against Pitt than CU did at home against Utah. Utah has been banged up. They are not the same Utah team as they've been in years past. Clemson just beat Pitt, that started off 7-0. They're now, Pittsburgh has completely fallen apart. They're on a 3-game losing streak. But if you look at where the rankings are on where Pitt would be outside of the top 25 versus Utah, that's a much more high quality win for Clemson. So Clemson moves up 4 spots, just like South Carolina's moving up a couple spots. Just like Tulane's moving up a couple spots. Tulane just wiped out Navy, 35-0, right? South Carolina beats a ranked Mizzou team. That's a high-quality win. ASU now going to be entering into the conversation. Our algorithm has them up to 20. I would be personally surprised if they were ahead of Army, but ASU just beat Kansas State, so you have to rank them above Kansas State. Maybe that's the right placement. I don't know. Either you're going to have to bring down Kansas State a little bit more, or Arizona State, yeah, maybe in that 21-22 area to allow Army to keep moving up. So, man, we're getting down to these final weeks, and things are starting to get a little bit tight, right? For teams that have dropped out, Mizzou lost to South Carolina, they're out. Louisville loses to Stanford in the most bizarre scenario. Stanford kicks a field goal to win at the very end. If you haven't watched the final of that, the final couple minutes of that game, I highly recommend. Just a complete implosion by Louisville. Washington State loses to New Mexico. I didn't even know that New Mexico was like a competitive team until I watched the end of this game. They have 4 or 5 wins now in New Mexico. That used to be a 0-1 win team every single year. They're now balling out. And LSU, just a complete fall from grace, right? If we take a look at LSU over the last couple of games, it has just been falling off a cliff, right? Started off a great week 1 game against USC. Nobody knows anything at that point. Go on a great tear right here. LLL, especially to Florida, who's been struggling. But man, that just is crushing. And they have a great strength of schedule. Wins against Ole Miss, loss against Texas A&M, got ran all over by Alabama, and that kind of rolled into Florida today. So they're gone out of the top 25. So this has been a crazy week in terms of ranking implications because, including Kansas State, if Kansas State had a worse loss, right, if they had really gotten blown out, we could have seen 5 teams get kicked out of the College Football Selection Committee top 25, which would have been nuts. That's a lot of movement. That's 20% of the teams get kicked out in 1 week. I don't know if we've seen anything that severe since the selection committee started going. But those are the current rankings right now. I would be very, very surprised if Mizzou or any of these teams hang within the top 25. So James Madison, Iowa State, UNLV have all brought themselves into the forefront. Arizona State's another one of those ones, right? They're all starting to creep in. ASU is now getting close with BYU and Colorado. There's a million tiebreaker scenarios, but that's going to be the really interesting thing is going into that Big 12 championship game. Who's going to be the one competing, right? Because they're going to have a really great shot at one of those top 4 bye seeds, essentially. CU, BYU, this is where the rankings are. They're getting really close. Kansas State really just blew their big shot. That's what they needed to win today. And to lose in that fashion to Arizona State really, really hurts their chances for making those top 12 teams. So here we are. For anyone else who's new to rankings right now, we have all of the scores right here. The San Diego State UNLV game is still in progress, but just crazy scores across the board today that I don't think a lot of people were really expecting, especially Washington State and New Mexico, Pitt and Clemson, right? Clemson had a 50-yard run at the very end of the game to really get into that position to win. Just really, really cool finishes. The big one going into the rankings this week is where are Indiana and Ohio State going to stay at 5 and 2, because that's going to be a monster matchup in Columbus next weekend. Does Georgia come all the way up to that 6th spot? Do they stay behind Notre Dame and Alabama, right? Alabama still has the win against Georgia. Does Alabama move up even higher? Does Georgia just fall a little bit lower, right? Georgia was the number 3 ranked team going into last weekend until they lost to Ole Miss. Are they ahead of Ole Miss again? Which is kind of a strange scenario. Does Georgia just magically jump ahead of Ole Miss after Ole Miss just beat them? This is the funny thing about rankings. You can't really describe a ranking. Try and just say to yourself, this is what a ranking is, right? Because it's not always as black and white as, well, this team would beat this team, because we've seen Alabama beat Georgia, because we've seen Georgia beat Ole Miss. The SEC is a complete mess of who's beat who when they beat them. But we've said the entire year, when it comes to rankings, especially with how the patterns have been in the past with both the AP poll or the selection committee or whatever really power rankings that you see, it is who you beat and when you beat them. That is the formula to putting together who is going to be ranked when and where. A ton of fun. It's hard to stay up this late to watch these games, right? But they have so much, the rankings implications are so large. It's so much fun. BYU dropping down 9 spots. Tennessee dropping down 7. Georgia moving up 6. Clemson up 4. Arizona State becoming relevant. It's so cool to have this tool available for everybody. So I think it's really enhanced my Saturdays. I built this to enhance the college football experience for everybody. It's like having a little secret and knowing something before everyone else. Everyone kind of wants that. It's a little bit more fun. So thanks for joining in. Subscribe to the channel. Join our newsletter. It's free. We go ahead and do deep dives into all of these different types of things. Follow us on X, Reddit, wherever you get your social media. We're on there. Thanks for joining in, and we will see on Tuesday how close the algorithm was to the final predictions. Thanks again for joining, and have a great rest of your weekend.